The alien world of Ithra was a place where beauty and grace were the currency of the elite. Tall, silver-spired cities reached toward a sky filled with swirling violet clouds, while below, in the sprawling underbelly of the capital, the streets were darkened by the shadows of crumbling buildings and decaying hope. It was in these neglected corners that Lyraha, a young alien girl, lived. Her small frame, fragile with pale scales that shimmered like frosted glass, marked her as different, and in a society that valued strength and beauty above all else, that difference made her invisible. Her disability was no secret. Her legs, with their strange joint structures, twisted unnaturally at the knees, rendering her unable to walk like others. Instead, she dragged herself across the dusty streets, her body weighed down not just by her deformity, but by the scorn of everyone she encountered. People passed her by, never sparing a glance. She had long ceased to expect anything different. She wasn't a beggar, though. She didn't ask for charity, not even from the wealthy merchants who roamed the boulevards, laughing and calling out to each other as they passed her by without so much as a second thought. The only time she'd ever been touched by another was when a servant, caught by her desperate gaze, might have reluctantly dropped a coin near her. And still, even the gesture felt like an insult. She wasn't the kind of person who could be seen as worthy of anything beyond a quick dismissal. Her existence, in their eyes, was nothing more than a blemish on an otherwise perfect world. It had been this way for as long as she could remember. Lyraha had never understood why she was born this way. As a child, she used to look at the others in her village, swift, graceful, all of them gliding with ease across the green fields and cobbled streets, and wonder what it was that made her different. She asked her mother, but the answer was always the same. You are special, Lyraha. Your path is simply different. But the words never comforted her. Instead, they only reinforced the isolation she felt. The rest of her people had no need to be special. They were perfect by default. She tried to be brave, to accept her place in the world, but her mind often wandered to the daydreams of a different life. A life where she might be seen, understood, where someone might acknowledge her not for what she lacked but for what she was. But those dreams were fleeting, always overshadowed by the cold reality of the world she inhabited. The sun was setting as Lyraha found her usual spot, a cracked stone bench near a quiet alley far from the bustling market square. It was a place few ever passed, and she relished the solitude. Today, like most days, she leaned her head against the cool surface of the bench and let the muted hum of the city fade into the background. In the distance, a group of children laughed as they played with an ornate ball, their legs nimble as they darted between one another. Lyraha sighed, closing her eyes. She had once longed to be part of their world, to feel the wind in her hair as she ran beside them, but now the only wind she ever felt was the one that whispered past her, carrying with it the voices of others who would never see her. As she sat there, something unusual happened. A figure approached, an off-worlder, a human. His boots clacked against the stone road as he drew closer, his eyes scanning the surroundings, taking in the strange, purple-tinted sky. Lyraha didn't look up. She had grown accustomed to humans, or rather to their disinterest in her. They were here for business, for trade, for exploration, and like the rest of the world, they had no time for her. But the human did not pass her by. He stopped just a few feet away, crouching down to her level. His presence was unusual, a bright, vibrant energy that contrasted sharply with the dull surroundings. His features were strong, his skin a pale hue with dark hair and eyes that gleamed with curiosity. He didn't look at her with pity, nor did he glance away in awkward discomfort like most did. Instead, he studied her with a gentle gaze, as though seeing something in her that others had missed. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice thick with an accent she couldn't quite place. Lyraha stiffened. He had spoken to her. But she quickly lowered her gaze, not wanting to meet his eyes. She was used to being invisible, and for a brief moment the simplicity of that invisibility was a comfort. "I'm fine," she murmured, barely audible. "Go on, traveler. There's nothing to see here." But the human didn't leave. Instead, he sat down beside her, his movements slow and deliberate. She could feel the warmth of his body radiating in the cool evening air, and it made her uncomfortable. His presence felt like a disruption, an intrusion into the carefully built walls of her world. "You're not fine," he said simply. "You're hurt." Lyraha's heart skipped a beat. No one had ever noticed before, not in a way that mattered. She glanced up and for the first time in years, saw that the human's eyes weren't full of judgment. They were full of something else. Something she couldn't name. "I'm just a crippled beggar," she spat, her voice harsher than she intended. "I don't need your charity." The human blinked, unfazed by her harsh words. "I'm not offering charity," he said quietly. "I'm offering you a moment of kindness." For a long moment the two simply stared at each other. Lyraha's breath caught in her throat as the weight of his words settled on her. She had expected him to stand and walk away like all the others. Instead, he remained beside her, offering her nothing but his presence. And somehow that presence, that small gesture, felt like more than she had ever received in her entire life. She didn't know what to say. She had no words for this strange encounter, this human who seemed to see her as more than a thing to be avoided. She only knew that in this moment, for the first time in a long while, she felt seen. In the days that followed, the human returned. He didn't speak much, but his presence became a steady fixture in Lyraha's routine. Each evening, like clockwork, he would appear in the same spot where she sat, close enough to the market that he could observe the lively bustle, but far enough away that it didn't matter. He brought no gifts, no food or trinkets, nothing that she could thank him for, which was perhaps why she never fully understood his motives. But every time he would sit beside her, silently, as though the space between them didn't matter. At first she resisted. She didn't know how to react to someone so disarmingly present in a world where absence was the rule. His quiet companionship grated against the solitude she'd built around herself for years. She found herself growing impatient with the human's kindness, unable to grasp why he didn't leave her in peace like everyone else did. Why was he here? Was he toying with her? But slowly something changed. The initial sting of his attention wore away, and in its place grew something unfamiliar, a subtle warmth. She began to look forward to the moments when he arrived, even if she never said a word. His presence was an anchor, pulling her out of her isolation, and though it terrified her to admit it, she started to feel a strange longing for his company. One evening, as the pale blue light of dusk stretched across the city, the human surprised her. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he paused, looking up at the sky, his face thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder what lies beyond the horizon?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was an edge of something deeper in it. Lyraha blinked. She hadn't expected him to speak, not like this. "What do you mean?" she muttered, avoiding his gaze. "The horizon is just a line. You can't cross it." The human smiled at her, his eyes reflecting something distant, something far away. "No one ever crosses it," he agreed, "but that doesn't mean it's not worth looking at. The world is bigger than just this place, Lyraha. There's more out there." Her chest tightened, a sharp pang of something bitter rising in her throat. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the idea that someone might actually believe in something beyond the prison of her world, or the thought that she would never be able to reach it. "You're wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what it's like here. No one cares. No one looks." The human sat down beside her, leaning his back against the worn stone of the bench. "That's where you're wrong," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. "I'm looking." The words hung between them, and for a moment Lyraha wanted to scream, wanted to ask him why. Why he couldn't see her like everyone else. Why he couldn't just leave her alone in the quiet of her misery. But instead she stayed silent, her heart aching in a way she hadn't expected. Over the next few days their meetings grew longer. The human, whose name she had learned was Elias, started to talk more, not just about his travels or the places he had visited, but about things that mattered to him. He told her about his family back on Earth, about the stars he'd once dreamed of touching, about his aspirations, his fears. And as he spoke, Lyraha found herself listening, truly listening, in a way she hadn't done for anyone in years. There was something about Elias that drew her in. His words, his way of seeing the world, as though the universe were full of possibility even in a place like this. Yet still, Lyraha struggled to understand him. She couldn't help but wonder why he bothered. Why was he so determined to get to know her, a person so clearly beneath him in every way? One evening, as a bitter wind swept through the streets, Elias turned to her with a quiet intensity in his gaze. "You're not invisible, Lyraha," he said softly, his voice almost urgent. "You don't have to hide behind your silence. We can see you. And I'm not leaving." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't respond. The weight of his words pressed down on her, suffocating. She didn't know how to react to this strange, unwavering certainty in him. He was like nothing she had ever known. But she was also afraid. Afraid of how his kindness might unravel her. Afraid of what it meant to be seen. "I don't know what you want from me," she said, her voice trembling despite herself. "I'm nothing but a burden. A cripple. No one looks at me. No one cares." Elias' face softened, his eyes searching hers as if trying to reach something deep inside her that she had long buried. "I care," he said simply. "You matter. More than you think." Lyriha looked away, biting her lip to stifle the sudden rush of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. She had never been given such words, not by anyone. She didn't know how to hold them, how to let them settle into her heart without breaking it. And yet, despite the fear that clung to her like a second skin, a tiny seed of hope began to take root within her. A seed she had long buried beneath layers of self-protection. For the first time she allowed herself to imagine a world where she wasn't just a discarded thing, a piece of the world that no one cared to fix. Elias reached out then, hesitantly at first, as though uncertain of how she would react. But when she didn't pull away, he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was warm, human, and it sent a shock of something electric through her. She looked up at him, meeting his eyes for the first time without turning away. "I won't leave," Elias said again, his voice steady and full of promise. "You don't have to be alone anymore." Lyriha swallowed hard, her throat dry, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to do with this strange, unexpected tenderness. But as she sat there with the weight of his hand on her shoulder, she knew one thing for certain. He was different. And for the first time in years she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry the burden of solitude alone anymore. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Lyriha found herself drawn more and more to Elias. She had grown used to his quiet presence beside her, the warmth of his hand on her shoulder, the steady cadence of his voice as he told her stories of distant lands and the starry nights of Earth. She had begun to crave those moments, to look forward to the evening when he would sit beside her, as if he were a lifeline she had never known she needed. But even as she allowed herself to soften, to let his kindness seep into her soul, the harsh reality of their situation clung to her like an ever-present shadow. The truth was that nothing had changed. Lyriha was still the outcast. She was still a crippled, poor, and unwanted member of society. Nothing Elias did or said could erase the cruel caste system that ruled this world, nor could he make the alien society she lived in see her as anything other than what they had always seen her to be, unworthy. One evening, as she sat with Elias, watching the last remnants of sunlight fade over the horizon, she couldn't help but voice the thoughts that had been swirling in her mind for days. "Why do you stay?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. She didn't want to hurt him, but the question had been nagging at her. "You don't owe me anything. No one does. So why do you come back day after day?" Elias, who had been tracing patterns in the dust with his finger, paused and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. For a long time he didn't answer, as though considering her question carefully. Finally he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I stay because you matter, Lyriha," he said simply. "I stay because you're worth my time. Worth far more than this place, than the people who refuse to see you." His gaze softened. "You're not what they say you are." Her chest tightened at his words, the weight of them pressing down on her. She wanted to believe him. Oh, how she wanted to believe him. But there was a part of her that was too afraid. Too afraid of the reality she had lived with for so long. No one had ever said these things to her before. No one had ever looked past the surface of who she was and seen her as something more. "Elias," she began, her voice faltering as she struggled to find the right words. "You don't understand. They will never accept me. They will never see me as anything but broken." She looked away, unable to hold his gaze any longer. "You can't change that." He reached out, gently lifting her chin with his fingers, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were steady, unwavering. "I don't need them to accept you. I don't need them to see you for who you are. I just need you to see it." His hand lingered on her chin for a moment longer, then fell away, leaving a warmth behind that she couldn't shake. For a moment Lyriha didn't know what to say. She wanted to push him away, to tell him that he was wrong, that he didn't understand how deep the divide between them and everyone else really was. But there was a crack in her heart now, a crack that had been slowly widening ever since he had first sat beside her. "I can't," she whispered, barely audible. "I can't believe that. Not when everyone else is so certain of what I am." Elias didn't respond right away. Instead he stood up and turned to face her, his silhouette framed by the dimming sky. He looked so different in that moment, so much more than just a traveler, more than the kind, gentle human who had shown her compassion. He seemed to carry the weight of something bigger, something that made Lyra want to reach out and ask him to stay forever, to never leave her side. "I'm not asking you to believe it all at once," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the cool air. "I'm asking you to take the first step. Just one. As no one else will. And I think you deserve to know that you're more than what they've told you." Lyra remained silent, her mind swirling with confusion and doubt. She had spent so many years convincing herself that she didn't matter, that no one could love her, that no one would ever look at her and see anything but her disability. To hear Elias, a stranger from another world, say that she was worth something, that was terrifying. It was easier to hide behind her own self-loathing than to face the possibility that she was, in fact, worthy of love and respect. But then Elias did something unexpected. He turned away, taking a few steps toward the edge of the alley. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression softer than before. "You don't have to answer me now," he said, his voice still calm, but there was an unmistakable sadness in his eyes. "But I want you to know this. You are not alone anymore. Not if you don't want to be." The words hung in the air, and as Elias walked away, a part of her screamed for him to stop, to come back, to stay. But another part, the part that had long been buried beneath layers of fear and doubt, remained still. He didn't look back as he disappeared into the darkening streets, but Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. She sat there for a long time, alone once again, but this time it didn't feel quite as unbearable as it had before. The weight of his words, the tenderness in his touch, lingered with her. It was almost as though something inside her had shifted, even if she wasn't sure what. For the first time she didn't feel quite so invisible. And she knew deep down that Elias had given her a choice she hadn't had before. To remain hidden, to continue living in the shadows of her own fears, or to take that first terrifying step toward something better. Toward hope. The following evening Lyra didn't wait for Elias. She had made up her mind to meet him halfway, to prove to herself that she wasn't the person she had always believed herself to be. There was still hesitation gnawing at the edges of her resolve, but she pushed it aside. He had shown her kindness, something that no one had ever done before. And in doing so he had offered her a choice, to remain trapped by her own self-doubt or to step into a world where, perhaps for the first time, she wasn't just a broken thing. She dragged herself down the alleyway, her joints aching more than usual, but this time it didn't matter. Each painful step felt purposeful, like she was moving toward something larger than herself. She didn't know exactly what that something was, but Elias had made her believe it was worth seeking. When she arrived at the place where they usually met, the bench was empty. She blinked, her heart sinking just a little. Elias wasn't there, and for a moment she felt that familiar sting of loneliness. She had expected him to be there, as he always had been, waiting for her, offering her that strange, unwavering presence that had begun to feel like a lifeline. But tonight there was no sign of him. She sat down slowly, a mix of uncertainty and disappointment settling over her. Had he left? Had he grown tired of her as everyone else had? Or perhaps he had decided that he'd done enough, that she wasn't worth the effort. The questions spiraled in her mind, each one more suffocating than the last. But just as she was about to pull herself back into her shell, a voice called out from behind her. "You came." Lyra turned sharply, her heart lurching in her chest. Elias was standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his eyes watching her with a quiet intensity. He wasn't looking at her with pity, nor was there any hint of judgment in his gaze. Instead, there was only something deep and unspoken, something that told her he had been waiting for this moment as much as she had. "I didn't think you'd show up," she said before she could stop herself. The words were a mix of relief and uncertainty, and she hated herself for sounding so vulnerable. "I thought, maybe you wouldn't come back." Elias took a step closer, his expression softening. "I told you I wouldn't leave," he said simply, his voice steady and warm. Lyra's chest tightened, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something stir inside her that she couldn't name. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was close, so close. She was standing on the edge of something, and she wasn't sure whether she was ready to leap or to turn back. I'm not like everyone else," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not worthy of this. Of you. Of anyone's time. You should just leave." The words stung as they left her lips, but they were true, weren't they? She was broken. She was the outcast. She wasn't good enough for anything or anyone. Elias's face didn't falter. Instead, he stepped closer, lowering himself to sit beside her on the bench. I've never seen you as broken, Lyriha. I've seen you as someone who's been hurt, yes, but you're not beyond repair. You're not beyond feeling. And you're most certainly not beyond being loved. The air between them grew thick with the weight of his words. Lyriha's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. No one had ever said such things to her. Not her mother, not her peers, not anyone. She had never been allowed to be more than the sum of her flaws, her deformities, her mistakes. But Elias was looking at her like she mattered. She couldn't process it. She didn't know how to take this new reality. For so long, Lyriha had lived in the dark corners of her world, hiding from the truth of her own worth, telling herself that no one would ever care enough to see her, to truly see her. But Elias was showing her the opposite. He was holding a mirror up to her, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face the reflection staring back. I can't believe it, she whispered, shaking her head. I don't know how to believe it. Elias didn't say anything at first. He didn't press her or try to convince her with more words. Instead, he simply sat there, his presence unchanging. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a plea. He was offering her space, allowing her to come to her own understanding at her own pace. I'm not asking you to believe it all at once, he said, his voice calm. I'm asking you to trust me. And trust yourself, even if it's just a little. The simplicity of his request struck her more deeply than any grand gesture or declaration ever could. Trust. Lyriha closed her eyes, fighting the tide of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. It was hard, so hard, to allow herself this vulnerability. To admit that she had been living in a cage of her own making. But Elias had made her question the walls she'd built. Those walls that had kept her safe, but also kept her locked away from everything she could ever hope for. A single tear slipped down her cheek and she wiped it away quickly, almost ashamed. She wasn't supposed to cry. She wasn't supposed to feel so much, especially when everything inside her screamed that she should remain cold and distant. But as the moments passed, she found herself slowly letting go. Slowly opening up. She couldn't let go of everything all at once, but she could start small. I don't know how, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I want to. I want to try. Elias smiled, and in that smile there was no pity, no judgment. Just understanding. That's all I ask, he said softly. That you try. For the first time in a long time, Lyriha didn't feel like she was drowning in a sea of her own doubts. She was still afraid, still unsure, but now there was a tiny ember of something stirring inside her. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to her than she had ever imagined. And maybe Elias was the one who could help her see it. She wasn't alone anymore. And that for now was enough. The following days felt like a delicate dance, with every step Lyriha took trembling with uncertainty. She had promised Elias she would try, to trust him, to trust herself. And though she had no idea how to begin, she found herself looking for opportunities. The city had never felt more alive, its buzzing markets and crowded streets now not just reminders of her isolation, but a vibrant, almost overwhelming backdrop for the life she had yet to fully embrace. Elias had continued to show up as steady as ever, as though nothing had changed. But Lyriha had changed, at least a little. She was no longer entirely hidden behind her own walls. Sometimes she would catch his eye, and for the briefest of moments she would allow herself to smile. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had given anyone in years. But even as she tried to move forward, old habits crept in. The fear. The self-doubt. The voices inside her head that insisted she wasn't worthy of anything, not of Elias's kindness, not of a world that might see her as more than a broken thing. These thoughts clung to her like shadows, following her even when she stood in the light. One afternoon, as the sun began its descent, she found herself walking toward the usual meeting place. This time with purpose. Elias had told her to try. And for the first time in a long while, she was determined to give herself the chance to believe in something other than her own limitations. But when she reached the spot where they always sat, he wasn't there. The bench stood empty, just like it had been the first time she had come here alone. Her stomach twisted, the familiar pang of disappointment settling in. Maybe he's just busy. Maybe he's forgotten about me, she thought, her mind immediately jumping to the worst conclusions. Her heart dropped when she spotted a group of people walking nearby, laughing and talking as they passed by. Of course, she thought bitterly. He's not going to wait around for someone like me. I knew it was too good to be true. With a resigned sigh, Lyra turned to leave, the familiar ache of abandonment creeping back into her chest. But then as she moved past the edge of the alleyway, she heard a voice, low and familiar, calling out to her. Lyra. She froze, her pulse quickening as she turned to face him. Elias stood just beyond the corner, leaning against the stone wall of a building, looking at her with an intensity she couldn't quite read. His eyes softened when he saw her, but there was something guarded in his expression. I'm sorry, he said, his voice heavy with something unspoken. I didn't mean to keep you waiting. Lyra's heart gave an involuntary lurch, a mix of relief and confusion flooding her all at once. She wasn't sure what to say, so she simply shook her head, willing her voice to remain steady. It's fine, she murmured, though her words didn't quite match the sudden knot in her throat. Elias pushed himself off the wall and took a few slow steps toward her, his gaze steady but tinged with something like regret. I've been thinking, he began, his voice low, careful. About what you said the other day. About how you don't think you're worth my time. I want you to understand something. I choose to be here. I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for you. I'm here because I want to be here. The sincerity in his words hit Lyra harder than she expected. She had told herself over and over that no one, would ever willingly choose to be near her. But Elias had made that choice. He hadn't come out of obligation or pity. He had chosen to show up. I don't know what I'm doing, she said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. I don't know how to believe what you're saying. I don't know how to let go of all the things I've been carrying for so long. Elias took another step closer, closing the distance between them just enough so that she could feel the warmth of his presence, so close that she could almost forget how afraid she had always been of people. I know it's hard, he said gently. But you don't have to let go of everything all at once. Just let me be part of the process. Let me help even if it's just a little. We're in this together. His words were simple, but they landed with the force of something much bigger than themselves. Together. Lyra closed her eyes, breathing in the evening air as a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying slowly began to lift. She didn't have to do this alone. Elias didn't expect perfection. He didn't expect her to fix herself in a day. All he wanted was for her to take one small step toward trusting him, toward believing in herself. When she opened her eyes again, she found him standing there, waiting, patient, as if he already knew what she needed. As if he had been waiting for her to reach this point, even if she hadn't been ready. I don't know if I'm ready to trust yet, she whispered, barely able to keep the vulnerability from her voice. But I can try. For you. And for me. Elias smiled, the warmth in his eyes shining through the shadows of the evening. That's all I ask. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to know what's coming next. Just take the next step. That's enough for now. The simplicity of it all, the sincerity almost overwhelmed her. She had been so afraid, so terrified of letting anyone in, that she had almost missed the beauty of what Elias was offering her. The chance to walk beside him, to be beside him even when she didn't have all the answers. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Lyra felt like she could breathe without the crushing weight of her doubts suffocating her. Okay, she said softly, the word tentative, yet filled with a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. I'll take that step. And with that simple act, something inside her shifted, a door opening just a crack, letting in the light she had long since shut out. She didn't know what the future held, or if she could ever fully let go of the past. But for the first time in ages, Lyra didn't feel entirely alone. The next few days were a strange mix of awkward silences and small, tentative steps forward. Lyra found herself seeking Elias out more often, each time with a mixture of anticipation and fear. She was slowly learning to trust him, but there were times when the old walls, the ones she had built to keep herself safe, rose up inside her without warning, threatening to shut him out once more. Every time she felt herself pull away, though, she reminded herself of the small promise she had made to herself. Just take one more step. She had to admit that it wasn't as difficult as she'd imagined. Elias made it easy with his steady presence, the way he listened to her when she spoke, the way he never pushed her beyond what she was ready for. He made her feel seen, not as the broken thing the world had painted her, but as someone worth understanding. One afternoon, as she was working on a small makeshift project outside her quarters, she saw him coming toward her. He was walking slowly, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his gaze fixed on the ground. There was something in the way he carried himself, a heaviness in his step that made Lyra pause. Her heart skipped a beat. Elias had always been a steady presence in her life, a rock that she could lean on when the weight of her past threatened to crush her. But now, as she watched him draw closer, she realized he was carrying something she couldn't quite place. When he reached her, he didn't immediately speak. His silence was so thick, so out of character that it made Lyra nervous. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tentative. She took a step toward him, wanting to bridge the distance between them, but unsure of how to approach the situation. Elias finally looked up, and there was a flicker in his eyes that unsettled her. Something had changed, something she couldn't identify. He paused for a moment as if trying to find the right words, but when he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, almost hesitant. "I need to tell you something," he said. The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy fog. Her stomach tightened and a sense of foreboding crept in. She tried to prepare herself for whatever he was about to say, but it was hard to shake the feeling that she was about to hear something that might tear them apart. "I don't know how to say this," he continued, his gaze flicking to the ground again before meeting her eyes. "But I think I've been holding something back. Something important." Lyra's chest constricted. What could it be? She had thought that the worst of their issues had passed, that the doubts and fears she had been carrying around had begun to fade with his constant support. But now Elias's words made everything feel fragile again, as though they were standing on the edge of something they couldn't control. "I'm not from here," Elias said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The words landed heavily between them, the truth of them ringing through the air like a bell. Lyra blinked, processing his statement. "What do you mean? You're from Earth, right?" He was confused. They had talked about his home planet before, about the differences between it and her world, but this was something else entirely. She wasn't sure what he was trying to say. Elias nodded, but there was a tension in his posture, a tightness to his jaw that made her feel like he was holding something back, something bigger than she could grasp. "I'm not just from Earth," he said slowly. I'm not even from this universe." Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" He sighed, stepping back and running a hand through his hair, clearly conflicted. "I don't know how to explain it. I'm not from the same timeline or dimension that you are. I'm not supposed to be here." The words crashed into her like a thunderclap, leaving her breathless and disoriented. For a moment, the world around her seemed to blur, as though she was no longer fully connected to it. She felt as though she were falling, plummeting into the unknown with no way to stop herself. "You're not from this universe," she repeated, her voice hoarse. It didn't make sense. She had spent so much time getting to know him, trusting him. Could he really be hiding something this big from me? Elias nodded, his expression apologetic. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to complicate things, especially when you've already been through so much. But I think it's time you knew the truth." Lyra took a shaky step back, her mind racing, her thoughts tangled. How could I not have known? She wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers. But all that came out was a soft, broken whisper. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Elias looked pained. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid that if you knew, you'd never look at me the same way again." The truth of his words hit her harder than she expected. She had spent so long hiding her own secrets, convincing herself that no one could understand her pain. And now here was Elias standing in front of her, vulnerable in a way she hadn't known he could be. "You could leave then," Lyra said, her voice trembling. The thought of him leaving, of him vanishing like some ghost from another world, made her chest tighten with a sudden, sharp panic. Elias shook his head quickly, almost desperately. "No. I don't want to leave you. I told you, I'm here because I want to be. I'm not going anywhere, Lyra. But I need you to understand the full picture. There's more to my presence here than you know. More than I can explain right now." Lyra's mind was racing, a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and disbelief. But beneath all of it, she could still feel that small, fragile ember of hope he had given her, the one that told her that she didn't have to face this alone. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, feeling completely lost. She wanted to reach out to him, to hold on to him, but her fear of being abandoned, of being left behind, clung to her like a vice. "You don't have to say anything," Elias said gently. "Not yet. Just know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm not giving up on you no matter what happens." For a moment they stood there in silence, the weight of the truth settling between them. Lyraha's heart beat erratically in her chest, the fear still present, but now there was something else too, a small, flickering sense of trust. Elias was telling her the truth. He was standing here, vulnerable and raw, just as she had begun to do with him. Maybe, just maybe, they could face whatever came next together. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy tension, a quiet but palpable shift between them. Lyraha couldn't stop thinking about what Elias had told her. His admission about not being from her universe, his confession that everything she thought she knew about him was just the tip of an iceberg. She had so many questions, but every time she opened her mouth to ask, the words caught in her throat. Elias was still there, still present in her life, still offering the same steady presence he always had. But now, every glance, every touch, every word he spoke felt weighted, as if there were invisible barriers between them that hadn't been there before. One evening she found herself sitting by the window, staring out at the city as the last remnants of daylight bled away into night. The streets below were busy, filled with people who moved with purpose, oblivious to the fact that she felt like she was living in a different world entirely. She wasn't sure what she expected. Maybe that Elias would disappear, or that he would finally tell her more about why he was here. But it didn't happen. Instead, he arrived at their usual spot, just after sunset, as if he had been waiting for this moment too. "Lyraha," he said softly, standing a few steps away. She didn't turn to look at him at first, but she could feel his presence like a pull, as undeniable as the gravity that kept her rooted to the earth. "I know you have questions," he continued, his voice gentle but firm. "And I understand if you need space. But I'm here and I want to answer what I can. But there are things that you might not be ready to hear. And I need to know, are you still willing to listen?" The question hung in the air between them, a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. Lyraha didn't know how to answer. She wasn't sure if she was ready to hear everything he had to say. But the desire for understanding, the desire to know him more deeply than she ever had before, was undeniable. "I don't know," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know if I can take it all in." Elias stepped closer, his silhouette outlined by the fading light. "I'm not asking you to take it all at once. Just trust me enough to hear it. One step at a time." She swallowed hard, turning to face him, her heart racing. The vulnerability she felt, the fear, the hope, it all rushed through her in a rush of emotion. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Hey, well, listen. But you have to be honest with me. All of it." He nodded, his expression softening. "I promise." He sat down beside her on the bench, the space between them filled with quiet anticipation. The city sounds, the hum of the marketplace, the distant chatter of people, seemed to fade into the background as he spoke. "I'm not just from another universe," Elias began, his voice low and steady as though he was carefully choosing his words. "I'm from a parallel dimension, a version of this world that's so similar, yet so different, that it might as well be another universe altogether. I came here because I needed to find something. Something that had been lost. Something important. And I was willing to risk everything to do it." Lyraha absorbed his words, feeling a strange mix of awe and disbelief. Her mind struggled to comprehend the scale of what he was saying, but she held on to the fact that Elias wasn't lying. His words weren't just words. They were truths wrapped in a vulnerability she had never expected from him. "What's so important?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. Elias paused, his eyes shadowed with something that seemed like regret. "I came here looking for a way to stop something that's coming. Something that could destroy both our worlds. And the only way I can stop it is by finding you." Lyraha's heart skipped a beat. "Me?" she whispered, incredulous. "What do you mean, me? Why would you be looking for me?" He turned to her, his gaze intense but filled with something else. Concern maybe, or fear. But something more personal. Something that made her heart race despite the confusion swirling in her mind. "Because you're the key, Lyraha. You are the answer to what's coming." The words hit her like a jolt of electricity, her body stiffening as her mind scrambled to catch up with the enormity of his statement. "What do you mean I'm the answer? How can I possibly?" I know it's hard to understand, Elias cut in, his voice soft but urgent. But the universe I came from, there's something in your DNA, something in you that can stop the disaster we're facing. I don't know how yet, but I know it's there. You're not just a victim in all this, Lyra. You're the one who can save us all. She shook her head, unable to grasp the magnitude of what he was saying. But I'm just me. I don't have anything special in me. I'm not. She stopped herself, the old doubts rising once more. You're more than what you've been told, Elias said firmly, his hand gently resting on hers. You're more than the things you've been made to believe about yourself. Your past doesn't define you, Lyra. What matters now is that you have the potential to stop something worse from happening. We need to work together. We need to figure out what it is and how to unlock it before it's too late. The weight of his words settled on her like a blanket of uncertainty and dread. She didn't know how to reconcile the person she had been with the person he was telling her she could become. She had spent so many years telling herself that she was too broken to be anything more than a bystander, a silent witness to a world that moved around her. But Elias was asking her to believe that she could be more, that she could be the key to saving everyone. Her breath caught in her throat. Could she do this? Could she really become something that could change the course of everything? She wasn't sure, but in that moment, something inside her stirred. Something deeper than the doubts. Something that whispered to her that she wasn't as alone, as powerless as she had once believed. I don't know how, she whispered almost to herself. But I'll try. Elias smiled, the warmth in his eyes giving her the courage she needed. That's all I'm asking. We'll figure it out together. One step at a time. Lyra took a deep breath, her hand still resting in his, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was capable of something greater than she had ever imagined. He said. The following weeks passed in a blur of training and discovery. Lyra had begun to trust Elias, but she still couldn't fully grasp what he had said about her role in this vast, interdimensional conflict. Each day he helped her explore what was buried within her, but it all felt so foreign, so out of place. She was still that outcast, the one no one had ever chosen, now expected to be the key to stopping a cataclysmic event. The weight of it was suffocating at times, and she found herself questioning everything. The choices that had led her here, the person she had become, and the strange pull she felt toward Elias, who was both her anchor and the source of her uncertainty. They worked together, practicing skills that seemed beyond what she should have been capable of. Elias taught her how to control the energy flowing within her. A force she had never known existed, let alone that it could be harnessed. Her body responded to it in strange, almost instinctual ways, and every time she tapped into it, it left her feeling like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, gazing out over a vast unknown. She still didn't understand how or why this power had been locked within her, or how it was supposed to stop the impending disaster Elias had warned her about. But each day the pieces of the puzzle started to form, the fragments of a picture she couldn't quite see. It was as though she were learning a language she had never heard before, foreign, alien, and yet somehow familiar. One evening, as they sat together by the quiet glow of a distant fire, Elias spoke again, his voice quieter than usual, almost reverent. There's more to it than just unlocking your abilities, Lyra. The power inside you, it's part of something much bigger. A force that connects all dimensions. All universes. It's not just about stopping a catastrophe. It's about preserving the balance between everything that exists. Lyra frowned, confused. What do you mean? The balance of what? Elias met her eyes, his gaze serious, intense. You were never meant to live in isolation. You're one of a few. People like you. People who can bridge the gap between universes. And that's what the enemy wants. They want to destroy that balance. They want to collapse everything to make the universes fold in on themselves. She swallowed hard, trying to process the enormity of what he was saying. So, I'm supposed to stop the collapse of everything? Yes, he said simply, but there was an undercurrent of urgency in his voice that made her shiver. And not just you. The others like you are out there. I've been searching for them too. But you're the closest. You're the first one I've found who has the power. Who's connected to everything in the way we need. It felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet, as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice, and she couldn't even see the bottom. The idea that she wasn't alone in this, that there were others out there like her, should have been comforting, but it only deepened the sense of dread settling in her chest. I'm not ready for this, she whispered, her voice shaky. How could I be? I don't even understand half of what you're saying. Elias reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady. You don't have to understand everything right now. Just take it one step at a time. We're in this together. And you have something that no one else has, something that no one else can teach you. This is your journey, Lyra. I'm here to help guide you, but the rest is up to you. The weight of his words pressed down on her, but she could hear the conviction in his voice, the belief that she was capable of something greater than she had ever known. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust in this strange, unexplainable power that had been awakened inside of her. But even now she could feel the doubts swirling within, the same fears she had carried for so long. What if she wasn't strong enough? What if she couldn't control it? What if, in the end, it was all too much for her to bear? I'm scared, she admitted, her voice small. I don't know how to handle any of this. Elias's expression softened, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. I know. And it's okay to be scared. I'm scared too. But I'm not going to let you go through this alone. We'll face it together. Every step. Every challenge. We do it together. For the first time in weeks, Lyra felt the tight knot in her chest loosen, even if only a little. Elias's words were a balm to her bruised spirit. He was right. She didn't have to do this alone. The next morning they set out again, training more vigorously than before. Elias pushed her, gently but insistently, encouraging her to reach deeper into herself. He guided her as she learned to channel the energy that coursed through her veins, teaching her how to focus it to make it bend to her will. There were times when she felt like she was teetering on the edge of something profound, as though she could feel the pulse of the universe itself running through her, just waiting for her to unlock its secrets. But each time she reached too far too fast, she felt a dangerous, overwhelming surge, a current too powerful to control. It terrified her, but Elias was always there to steady her, his calm voice reminding her to breathe, to focus, to take it one step at a time. It was late one afternoon when everything changed. They had been practicing in a secluded area of the city, far from prying eyes. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the landscape, when Lyra felt the familiar surge of power rising within her. She was about to call it back, to rein it in, when something shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint ripple in the air, like a disturbance in the fabric of reality itself. Elias's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he watched her. No, he whispered urgently, don't. But it was too late. The power inside her erupted, uncontrolled, a tidal wave of energy that swept through the air like a storm. It crackled, snapping at the edges of her consciousness, and for a moment Lyra could feel it all. The other dimensions, the balance of the universe, flickering, trembling beneath her touch. She didn't know what she had done, but one thing was certain. Everything had just changed. The aftermath of that moment stretched long and uncertain, like the eerie quiet after a thunderstorm. Lyra stood in the center of the clearing, trembling, her body still humming with the raw energy she had unleashed. She could feel the power inside her, coiling and pulsing almost like a living thing. It was more than she could control, more than she had ever imagined it could be. Elias was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on her, his brow furrowed with something between concern and awe. She couldn't meet his gaze, not yet. She felt exposed, like she had just revealed something too dangerous to understand, let alone harness. I didn't mean to, she whispered, her voice shaking as she tried to steady herself. Her hands trembled as they fell to her sides. Elias finally spoke, his voice steady but laced with a tension she had never heard before. It wasn't your fault. You didn't do this on purpose, Lyra. But we need to figure out what triggered it. What happened just before it happened? Did you sense anything? Lyra searched her memory, trying to pinpoint the exact moment the power had surged beyond her control. There had been a feeling, yes, but it had been so fleeting, almost imperceptible, like the faintest ripple across the surface of a calm pond. I felt something, she said slowly, her voice distant as she replayed the events in her mind. It wasn't like before. It was stronger. I wasn't just tapping into the energy, I felt connected to it in a way that was almost alive. Elias's eyes sharpened, his expression becoming more focused. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. What do you mean alive? He asked. I don't know. Lyra's voice faltered. It was like the energy was responding to me, like it was waiting for me to do something. But it wasn't like before. It wasn't just me directing it. It was feeding off of something. A heavy silence fell between them. Elias turned away for a moment, his gaze drifting to the horizon, where the last traces of sunlight were beginning to fade. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, but he didn't speak for what felt like a long time. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, more intense. "I think you've tapped into something you weren't meant to," he said quietly. "This isn't just about unlocking your abilities, Lyriha. It's about you connecting to something far deeper, something that shouldn't be so easily accessed." "What do you mean?" she asked, her heart quickening in her chest. "What's deeper? What did I just do?" Elias hesitated, the words clearly weighing on him, but he didn't back away. "The energy inside you isn't just power. It's a conduit, a bridge between the dimensions. And it's connected to something older, something that has been in place since before any of us were born." Lyraha's mind struggled to keep up, to process the gravity of what he was saying. "A bridge," she repeated, her voice thick with confusion. "But that's impossible. I'm just me, Elias. I'm not some key to some ancient force." "You are, Lyriha," he said, his voice firm. "But what you've awakened isn't just any power. It's the energy that holds everything together, and what you felt today was the first real connection to it. It's not just about the collapse of universes. It's about the balance between everything. The energy you're accessing, it's tied to that balance. It's the force that maintains the separation of dimensions, the stability of everything we know." She shook her head, unable to fully grasp what he was saying. "You're saying that I'm the key to keeping all of this from falling apart?" "Yes," he said softly, his voice a quiet certainty. "But it's not just about your ability to control the energy. It's about what that energy represents. You're not just tapping into it, you're connected to it. And that connection is what could either save everything or destroy it." She felt the weight of his words settle into her chest, heavy and suffocating. A part of her wanted to recoil, to deny the truth of it, to convince herself that it was all a mistake, that she was just an ordinary person caught up in something far beyond her. But deep down she knew he was right. "You said there are others like me," she said quietly, her mind reeling. Are they in danger too? Because of this?" Elias's face darkened. "Yes. They're all in danger. And if we don't figure out how to control this, how to understand the true nature of the energy you're connected to, then they will all be in danger. And so will you." Lyraha's heart raced. "What do we do? How do we stop it from getting worse?" Elias stood still for a long moment, his gaze intense and searching. He seemed lost in thought, as if the weight of what he was about to say was as heavy for him as it was for her. "We need to find the others like you. We need to bring them together. If they are the key to understanding this, then we need to do everything we can to protect them." "But how?" Lyriha asked, her voice rising with urgency. "Where do we even begin? How can we find them?" Elias looked at her then, his expression softening with a mix of resolve and something else, something she couldn't quite place. "We start by trusting what you've just discovered. Trusting that whatever bond is forming between you and the energy, that connection, it will guide us to them. You were never meant to carry this burden alone." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise and fear. Lyriha knew deep down that Elias was right. She wasn't alone in this. But as much as that thought comforted her, it also terrified her. The future was uncertain, and the path ahead was fraught with dangers she could hardly understand, let alone prepare for. "I'm scared, Elias," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I can't do it? What if we're too late?" Elias's gaze softened, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think. We'll find a way through this. Together." And though her doubts still lingered, though the weight of the universe seemed to rest on her shoulders, Lyriha found herself clinging to his words. She had no choice but to move forward, into the unknown, into the vastness of the energy that flowed through her, and into whatever awaited her on the other side. The days blurred together in a frantic rush of travel and quiet moments, each step taking Lyriha and Elias closer to the unknown. They had to move quickly, time was running out. The surge of energy inside her was growing, becoming harder to control, and the strange, almost intuitive pull toward the others like her was growing stronger with each passing day. They had gathered only the barest scraps of information about the others, scattered fragments that Lyriha wasn't sure how to piece together. Elias had told her of rumors, ancient stories, and whispered legends. some of which spoke of people like her with the power to bridge the dimensions to shape reality itself. But none of it felt real enough. She had never seen these others. She had no idea where they were or how to find them. Her mind raced with doubt, and every step felt like an impossible journey. There were times, alone in the quiet of the night, when she could hear her own heartbeat too loudly, each thump a reminder of how small she felt in the vastness of everything they were facing. "How will we know when we find them?" she asked Elias one evening as they sat in the shadow of a crumbling structure, the last rays of the sun slipping behind distant mountains. She looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "How will we know who they are?" Elias was quiet for a long time, his eyes far away, as if he too were questioning how they would navigate this overwhelming task. When he spoke, his voice was low but sure. "We'll feel it," he said simply. "You felt the connection before when you tapped into the energy. When you reach the others, you'll know. It's not something that can be explained. It's something you'll recognize when it happens." She nodded, but even as she did, doubt still gnawed at the edges of her mind. How could she trust in something so intangible? How could she trust herself? But Elias was right about one thing: her power had grown. She had begun to understand it, even if only in glimpses. When she closed her eyes and reached inward, she could feel the subtle hum of energy that ran just beneath the surface of her skin, like the thrum of a distant heartbeat. There were moments when she could focus on it, direct it, but it still eluded her when she needed it most. The fear that accompanied it had not lessened, but there was something else, something raw and urgent that kept her moving forward. Then came the day it happened. They had crossed into a new city, its towering spires rising from the mist like the jagged teeth of some great sleeping beast. The air felt different here, charged with something unfamiliar. The streets were bustling, filled with beings from all walks of life, but to Lyra's eyes the city felt hollow. There was a tension in the air that seemed to hang over everything, as though the very ground they walked on was trembling. And that was when it hit her. A sudden, sharp pulse of energy so powerful that it made her stomach churn. It wasn't like the subtle hum of her own power. This was something else, something foreign, something alive. It reverberated through her, filling her senses with a heat that threatened to consume her. "Elias," she gasped, reaching out for him. He was already standing, his eyes scanning the crowd. He had felt it too, she could tell. There was a quiet urgency in his movements, a tense alertness that made her heart race. "They're close," he muttered, his voice almost to himself. "We need to move. Quickly." They weaved through the crowd, heading toward the source of the pulse. The feeling inside Lyra was unmistakable now. This was what she had been waiting for. This was the moment she had felt in the back of her mind for days. The moment when everything would finally align. The energy grew stronger with each step they took. It pulsed like a heartbeat, reverberating through her chest, through her limbs, until she felt as if she were vibrating with it. It was as if the world itself was trembling in response to it. Then they found her. Lyra stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The woman stood before them, just at the edge of the crowd, her figure almost ethereal against the fading light. She was tall, with skin that shimmered like liquid silver, her hair dark and streaked with iridescent colors that seemed to shift with every movement. Her eyes were glowing faintly, a soft luminescence that seemed to pierce through the dimming city. Lyra's heart raced. This was it. This was the person she had been searching for. She didn't need to ask who she was. She could feel it. This was one of the others like her. The woman's gaze met hers, and for a long moment, there was only silence, the weight of the connection hanging heavy between them. It was as if the air itself was charged with energy, vibrating with the intensity of their meeting. Lyra felt it deep in her bones, a rush of understanding, of belonging. But then the moment was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. Elias's hand gripped her arm, pulling her closer, and the woman's eyes flickered with a sudden wariness. "They'll be coming for us soon," the woman said, her voice smooth and melodic, but tinged with an edge of urgency. "We don't have much time." Lyra's mind raced. Who was she? How did she know they were coming? And what did she mean by they? "Who's after us?" Elias asked, his voice tight with the tension that had been building between them since the moment they had felt the surge. "They," the woman said again, her expression hardening. "The ones who want to destroy everything. They know about us, about what we can do. And they won't stop until we're all gone." Lyra's pulse quickened, the fear creeping back into her chest. But she could see the truth in the woman's eyes. She had felt the same pull, the same strange connection. She was one of them, and that meant they were all in this together. Whatever was coming, whatever force threatened to tear apart everything, it was closer than they had thought. "We need to move," the woman said urgently. "We need to find the others. Before it's too late." Lyraha's heart pounded in her chest, and the weight of the world seemed to crash down on her. They had found one of the others, but now they were running out of time. The balance of everything was hanging by a thread, and all she could do was hope that this first step was enough to turn the tide before it all came crashing down. The air in the narrow alleyway felt thick, pressing against Lyraha's chest as she followed the woman, who had introduced herself as Nira. Elias stayed close behind, his eyes darting back and forth, ever watchful, while Lyraha's thoughts swirled in a storm of questions. Nira had led them through the city, her pace quick and purposeful, as if she had been waiting for them to find her. But it wasn't just the urgency in her movements that unsettled Lyraha. It was the way Nira seemed to know exactly what was happening, how she had anticipated everything. Lyraha couldn't help but wonder how long Nira had known she was connected to the strange energy. How long had she been watching them? And more importantly, how many others like them were there? The alley they had entered felt like a different world entirely, quiet, hidden away from the bustling city. Shadows stretched long and dark between the buildings, and the only sound was the soft echo of their footsteps. Nira stopped suddenly, turning to face them, and Lyraha had to fight the urge to step back. There was something unnerving about the woman, something both comforting and dangerous at once. "We're close," Nira said, her voice low, eyes scanning the surrounding darkness. "The others are waiting." Lyraha opened her mouth to ask more questions, but Nira raised a hand, silencing her with a sharp, knowing glance. There was no time for explanations, it seemed, only action. Nira motioned for them to follow as she moved deeper into the alley, her pace picking up once again. Lyraha hesitated, exchanging a glance with Elias. His jaw was set, his brow furrowed in concentration. He seemed just as tense as she felt. They didn't know where they were going, didn't know who the others were or what kind of danger awaited them, but Lyraha felt the pull of something bigger than herself guiding her steps. After what felt like an eternity of weaving through darkened streets, they arrived at a seemingly ordinary building. An old, abandoned structure that looked like it had been forgotten by time. But when Nira stepped forward and pressed her hand against a stone panel at the entrance, the wall shifted, revealing a hidden door. "Welcome," Nira said, her voice almost a whisper now. "This is where we gather." Inside, the space was dimly lit, with the faint glow of energy that hummed from beneath the floorboards. The room was circular, and the walls were covered in intricate symbols and markings that seemed to pulse in time with the rhythmic thrum of the power in the air. At the center of the room stood several figures, their faces hidden in the shadows, their postures tense and expectant. Lyraha's heart skipped a beat. There were more of them. More people like her. They were connected to the same energy she had only begun to understand, and they were here waiting for her. But the realization came with a weight she hadn't anticipated. Nira moved to the center of the room, and without speaking, the others stepped forward. Lyraha's eyes flicked between them, each one exuding a quiet power, a calmness that seemed to contrast the storm of uncertainty inside her. "This is Lyraha," Nira said, her voice carrying through the room. "And Elias. They've come for answers just as we all have." Lyraha looked at the faces in the room, some of them young, others older, but all of them carrying the same distant air, as if they too had known for a long time that they were part of something larger, something dangerous. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with questions that no one was yet ready to ask. A woman stepped forward, her long dark hair cascading around her shoulders like a veil. Her eyes locked onto Lyraha's, and she didn't flinch, didn't look away, as though assessing her very soul. "You've felt it, haven't you?" the woman said, her voice smooth and unwavering. "The pull of the energy. The connection." Lyraha nodded slowly. "I have," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's stronger now. And I can't control it." The woman's eyes softened, and she stepped closer, her presence somehow calming despite the intensity of the situation. "None of us can control it, not completely," she said. "But we've learned to live with it. To understand it." "I don't understand any of it," Lyraha admitted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I don't know why this is happening to me. I don't know why any of this is happening." The woman smiled, a knowing look crossing her face. You will. In time we all do. But first we have to face what's coming. What's coming? Elias asked, his voice edged with concern. The room grew quieter as if every person within it held their breath, waiting for the answer. The woman turned to the others, her gaze moving from one face to the next before settling back on Lyraha. There are forces, dark forces, that seek to control the energy we carry, she said, her voice growing heavier. They've been hunting us for centuries, trying to harness our power for their own purposes. And now they're closer than ever. Lyraha felt the words reverberate through her chest, a chilling realization creeping up her spine. The enemy wasn't just an abstract idea anymore. It wasn't just whispers on the wind. It was real. And it was coming for them. We're all connected, the woman continued. Our power is what holds the balance of this world, of every world. If they succeed in taking us down, the consequences will be catastrophic. But why? Lyraha asked, the question bursting from her lips before she could stop it. Why us? Why are we the ones they're after? The woman sighed, her shoulders sagging with the weight of something too vast to explain in a few words. We are the last of our kind. Those who are capable of harnessing the energy. Those who can open the doors between worlds. And if the wrong hands get hold of that power, her voice trailed off as if the mere thought of it was too much to bear. Elias stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. How do we stop them? The woman's gaze flickered toward Nira before she looked back at them, her expression grim. We need to unite. All of us. If we can work together, we might be able to resist them. But the longer we wait, the stronger they get. And if we fail? Lyraha's stomach churned with fear and uncertainty. They had no time to waste, no room for error. The weight of the world, it seemed, was resting on their shoulders, and she didn't know if she was strong enough to carry it. The room felt colder now, the air thick with the gravity of their situation. Lyraha stood at the center of the gathering, her mind racing, her heart pounding against her ribs as she processed everything that had been said. The woman who had spoken, Zira, seemed calm, even resigned, but Lyraha could see the weight of her words in the taut set of her shoulders, in the sharpness of her eyes. We don't have much time, Zira said, her voice a low murmur that echoed slightly in the stillness of the room. They've already started. They'll be here soon. Lyraha swallowed hard. The realization that they were being hunted was no longer an abstract concept. It was a reality they were facing right now. The dark forces Zira had spoken of, the ones that sought to control their power, weren't some distant threat. They were out there, closing in, ready to strike. What do we do? Elias asked, his voice steady but laced with the same tension Lyraha felt. How do we stop them? Zira's gaze flickered briefly to Nira, the two exchanging a look that spoke volumes without a single word. The silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken decisions. Finally, Zira turned back to the group, her expression hardening. There's no one solution. We can't fight them head-on, not yet anyway. The energy we wield is our greatest weapon, but it's also our greatest vulnerability. Lyraha felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't sure what Zira meant by that, but the implications were unsettling. If their power was a vulnerability, it meant they were already at a disadvantage. Then what? Elias pressed, his brow furrowing. How do we protect ourselves? Zira's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something like determination crossing her face. We need to find the Heartstone. It's the only thing capable of shielding us, of keeping the energy from being controlled. But it's not easy to find. It's hidden, and even if we find it, we may not be able to unlock its power. Lyraha felt a surge of hope, quickly followed by doubt. The Heartstone, she had heard legends about it, whispers of an ancient artifact with the power to protect them. But to actually find it? To unlock it? She wasn't sure if that was something they could do, not with the clock ticking down on them. Where is it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zira's gaze hardened. That's the problem. We don't know for sure. But there's a place, an old temple deep in the mountains. It's said to be the last known location of the Heartstone. Elias's expression darkened. The mountains. He shook his head. It's a long way to go and we're already running out of time. We'll never make it. We don't have a choice, Zira said flatly, her tone unwavering. Without it, we're as good as dead. But with it, we have a chance. The Heartstone is the only thing that can give us the power to fight back. Lyraha's stomach twisted. A chance. That was all they had. It wasn't much, but it was something. And something was better than nothing. She turned to Elias, meeting his eyes. The determination in his gaze mirrored her own, and for a brief moment she felt the weight of the journey ahead settle between them. They had come this far together, and now they would have to go even further, facing dangers they couldn't yet comprehend. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "We'll find it." Zira gave a sharp nod, her expression one of approval, though there was no warmth in her gaze. It was the approval of necessity, not encouragement. The time for comforting words had long passed. The group moved quickly, packing their few belongings, gathering what little they had in preparation for the journey ahead. Nira stayed close to Lyraha, her eyes ever watchful, as if expecting something to happen at any moment. Elias walked beside her, his quiet presence a steadying force, though his own tension was palpable. They left the underground chamber, making their way through the dark streets, the city streets now feeling more like a maze than a home. The weight of their mission hung over them, suffocating in its intensity. Each step felt like it could be their last, each corner a potential ambush. Yet they pushed on, knowing that there was no other choice. The mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks cutting into the sky like teeth ready to bite. The temple Zira had mentioned was somewhere beyond them, hidden deep within the rocky expanse. Lyraha didn't know what awaited them, but she could feel the pull of something greater, something ancient, tugging at the core of her being. Hours passed as they trekked through the desolate landscape, the cold wind whipping against their faces. The terrain was unforgiving, a mix of steep cliffs and treacherous ravines that tested their resolve. But they kept moving, pushing forward, despite the exhaustion gnawing at their bodies. Each step brought them closer to the unknown. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, they reached the base of the mountains. The air was thinner here, and Lyraha felt the pressure building in her chest. Her breathing quickened, but she refused to stop. "We're close," Zira said, her voice cutting through the silence. "The temple should be just beyond that ridge." Lyraha nodded, feeling a renewed sense of urgency. They had come so far, and yet the real challenge was still ahead. The Heartstone. It seemed like a mythical object, a relic of the past, something beyond reach. But Zira's words echoed in her mind. Without it, they had no chance. The temple was waiting for them. It was there, just beyond the horizon, its ancient walls shrouded in mystery. And with it, their only hope.